it's no surprise to anyone here that the tech industry as a whole has really changed in the past few years. And I think a lot of us, the three of us, have been around to see that in a pretty direct way. So would love for you both to share in the past decade, let's say. So the what I would call like the glory days of tech, 2014 to 2021, and up until then, until like 2023 or 2024, let's say, in the past decade roughly, how has working in big tech changed as an employee? Especially, given the past year or so of layoffs and the tumultuousness that has happened. Would love for any commentary there. Maybe Steve, you want to go first on that topic?
I mean, I think go back before 2014,
Yeah,
if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would helpful. Do that.
I think the thing about big tech and the thing about software development in general is a bunch of things have absolutely stayed the same and are completely durable. And you can sort of go back in time and just be really comfortable with what's going on. Some of those things are designing systems, making sure that you're operationally efficient. The things that are completely different are, the tools that we use, right? So when I got hired, they threw me at a 100,000 line Perl system that processed a bunch of like books and images for, some back-end system at Amazon. And if you've ever had the pleasure of working with Perl, it's a write once sort of language, right? And I think it still runs quite a bit of Amazon in the background. That has been completely de-emphasized, right? So obviously, like languages change and frameworks change, but the concept of problem solving, the concept of like working together as a team, the concept of decomposing problems into smaller pieces and having teams sort of take different bites at a much larger like project, things are exactly the same, right? I had picked up a post-mortem document for Microsoft Word 1.0. And so basically, in the late 80s, they did a retrospective and post-mortem on why the project didn't go so well. And if you just swapped out some of the names of the technologies, it reads the exact same, right? They were using dates they were using estimates to figure out when something was going to get done instead of like using it as a tool to figure out when the software is going to land. They just started throwing people at particular problems. They had emphasized, the rate of code creation rather than creating quality code. And I find it just really super interesting that you can literally go back to the 80s and probably even before that and read about software development. And again, if you just swapped out the names of the technology. Concept of working within big tech where you are a smaller part of a much larger system, I find that those dynamics will be durable over time.
I think so. I had a couple of points to make on that, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit, but I think so. Like one obvious thing that seems to be changing, I guess, is on like people's mind is like the AI stuff, and obviously it's hard to predict the future. History doesn't like 100% repeat itself, but I think the best way to see how this might affect like jobs as well as just the market in general is to kind of look at like what has happened before. And I wasn't alive or like an engineer at that point, so I won't pretend that I was, but you can still kind of go back and look at history. When you look at like the .com stuff before like websites, there was still software engineering, but it was entirely different than it is today, in certain aspects at least. And then like in 2010-ish, web developer, mobile development became pretty big, and that kind of changed a lot of things, but still a lot of things stayed the same. So I think with AI, things are going to change, but a lot of things are probably still going to stay the same. I don't think, for example, like relational databases are going to go anywhere. They've stuck around for a while. Who knows? They might, but so I guess I can't give like the exact answer of what's going to stay the same and what's not gonna. But I think the general pattern of that isn't going to change. And kind of continuing that, when you look at the overall market, like what's happening now isn't entirely different than what happened in the past either. Like with the .com crash, people got laid off at that point as well. It was definitely different than it is today for different reasons and everything. But I think there is something different about software engineering as like an industry compared to other disciplines of engineering. For example, like today, at least speaking in the US, somebody can go to college, get a 4-year degree, and they can, in many cases, in some cases, they can make more than like an orthopedic surgeon right out of college. And that's insane. And I think when you have something like that, the industry is going to be a bit more like feast or famine compared to other STEM disciplines like medicine. You're probably not going to get laid off as a doctor. You're less likely to get laid off as like an electrical engineer or a civil engineer. So I think just like that's kind of my perspective about it. I definitely don't have as much experience as Steve on this, so I won't pretend to give like example stories. But I think that's how I approach this.
I don't know what happened. You can perceive the censorship, the technical issues.
How you get hired into the company, how you change teams within the company. A lot of that does end up evolving over time. And I do think, and this is jumping the gun a little bit, but in terms of what will continue to be the same going forward, I do think it's hard to imagine, but I think big tech will become even bigger, even more than it is now. Like
You can perceive the censorship. I'm going to close it in order to validate that it is because I'm loading several pages. And go. It is blocked. No.
I think that's an argument for like hitting the home run, going out and building a big company. But also, I think like Navi and Steve, like for the companies that we built out, haven't really taken meaningful venture capital, and they're doing quite well. So I think again, there's like this bifurcation that happens of either there will be companies that have tons of leverage, tons of reach and distribution, and they're going to raise a bunch of money, or there's going to be a lot of companies that are mostly struggling. And I think it's important to figure out where is the money and attention flowing, and how can you benefit from that change.
I think I disagree with a couple of your premises there, Rahul. So just to give you a sense of the rate of growth of Amazon, when I joined Amazon, I won't give the numbers, but there were less software developers than there are now in Prime Video, right? And so the Prime Video organization within Amazon is much larger than Amazon circa 2006. And I think the problem with your thesis that these big tech companies are just going to get even bigger is that there's this network effect associated with coordinating resources and new people that are coming in. And so I don't think that you can necessarily 10x Amazon again, right? If you want to talk about 10 million employees or a million sort of like white collar office workers, there is an overhead associated with coordinating that many people. And so I do think that one of the dynamics that's going to happen, and one of the things that we've seen in the past 10 years, is the advent of web services. Now, I don't need a data center now to do my startup, and I don't need a very large amount of capital to bootstrap my business. And so I think that generally big tech is going to stay the same amount, the same size, because at some point it buckles under the pressure of so many people that are working for it. And I see the barrier to entry for startups being much, much lower as big tech actually opens up the functionality to start a business through their web services.
Why can't both be true, right? I think the barrier to entry to doing your own startup, I mean, putting something, a mobile app or web app out there, just collecting money by providing value to people, that has never been easier. There's no denying that.
Yeah, exactly.
At the same time, though, why can't it also be true that if I'm Google, I always give another data point for all of you. Apple has $160 billion of cash. Meta has 61 billion. Like, these are insane amounts. They've effectively infinite money. I think Amazon and Google probably have a similar amount, right? And so when you have that much cash, I agree with you, Steve, that there's a huge coordination problem if you have like one product or one service and you have 10 more engineers or 100 or 1,000 more engineers on that. It's pretty hard to coordinate. But I think what's been happening, and Amazon's a good example of this, is that instead of just trying to tackle more engineers with the same problem, you just 10x the number of products you have. Like Google has Google X and Waymo and Google Search and Ads and YouTube. Like, they have tons of products. And so I could easily imagine a future where Apple and Google and Amazon keep building out more and more products to tackle every part of our life. And for that reason, it's effectively an unlimited appetite for technical talent.
Yeah, I think you have to think about whether the businesses make sense underneath the corporate umbrella, right? Because the idea is that you would spin businesses off that would be better together, right?
Yeah.
And so
But has it ever
Apple is
been
sitting on cash because they don't have a place to spend it. I think that's the big issue. And so they've effectively won, the mobile phone game or whatever it is, and we'll see how long it is. And I don't think it takes $100 billion to sort of bootstrap an augmented reality business, right? And so, there's a problem within Amazon. Maybe this is some dirty laundry, but you would think that our set-top box business and our streaming businesses would be better together, right? Oh, and we also have Twitch, so we have Twitch streaming, we have Prime Video, we have these Fire TV devices that sit on people's boxes that are really low cost. Well, here's the thing. We are in planning hell trying to get features that would just make sense, that would be better together between those organizations. And it actually slows us down quite a bit, right? When we try to figure out ways that we can be working together, not because the features, from an abstract sense, would be difficult to implement, but because now we're talking about multi-thousand people organizations. There's a bunch of moving targets, And the coordination costs between those organizations, where we should be able to see the sum is greater than the parts, actually makes it so we move a bit slower because of all of the people and the size of the organization.
Yeah. So I mean, I think what we agree on, Steve, tell me if I'm wrong, is that big tech's not going anywhere. Like, I don't envision in the next 10 or 15 years that the importance of Amazon is debatable. But I think talking about this point of bifurcation, I do believe pretty strongly that the world of the future is going to have these big dominant tech companies, and those aren't going anywhere, or they're going to have 1 to 5% very small companies that are going to be extremely productive with different development technologies and AI. And that middle ground of like, oh, we have like 50 people or bootstrap or 100 people, the frequency of those companies, my argument is that those will really be more and more rare unless they have a ton of venture capital backing. I think that's like the bifurcation that I think will become more prominent in the next 5 or 10 years. Okay, so that was interesting about the past decade, and we also jumped the gun a little bit talking about the next decade. Anything to add in terms of, curious about your predictions, Navi? I think you gave some already, but Navi or Steve, around what advice would you have, given your thoughts about the next 5 or 10 years in the tech industry? How should people think about preparing for that future?
I think that we are maybe jumping the gun that AI is going to be replacing our jobs. Maybe it's a bit reductionist, but I do see a lot of these large language models as being a glorified autocomplete. When we get to the point where they can check in, like an AI can check in code without human oversight, that's when I will start to be worried about things. How far away are we from that? That an AI can pick up a sticky, write the code, and check in, and it would deploy to prod without any human oversight. I think the stakes are just too high for that, and we'll have to back away from that amount of control for quite a while. Right? That would be the equivalent of allowing a trading bot, access to my brokerage account. Like, what ends up happening is that you end up putting a ton of safeguards in place, and those safeguards, that the automation of those safeguards turns into a full-time job itself, right? And so I really think that the AI revolution is really about strengthening humans and allowing them to make more high quality decisions, allowing them to sort of reduce the amount of undifferentiated work. And I think the unfortunate bit is that this AI stuff is happening during a round of layoffs where essentially all of these companies overhired during the pandemic, and you're seeing a reversion to the mean. And so there's this downward trend for demand, and this AI stuff sort of happening at the same time. It might lead you to conclude that there's this doom and gloom scenario where software developers aren't going to be necessary. But I think what's going to happen is that, after this reversion to the mean has completed, there will be a healthy appetite for software developers. And so those folks that know how to use AI to lever themselves and to scale are the ones that are going to be the most valuable in the future.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. And just thinking about it, like from my perspective, like if I had a tool, an AI tool, and we already kind of have tools like that just aren't like LLM based. There are AI tools that help with certain things, or just like AI is a very broad term, and I think at like Google there were tools that would like auto fix certain things. They would auto detect like errors in production, and then they would create like a pull request and it would assign it to somebody relevant. And so things like that actually do exist, and they're not super big in scope. Like that type of thing isn't gonna like make a super complex change in your code. It might change like a config file or something. And I think that from my perspective, it seems like having a tool that solves a small problem 100% of the time is actually more helpful than a tool that will solve a difficult problem 10% of the time. Because if it only works 10% of the time, that means the other 90% of the time it's wrong. And in many cases, for like a difficult problem, then you got to go through the code. You have to reverse the changes. It's going to waste more time when it's wrong than if it's right. So, and I think most people would agree that when you're using any kind of thing in real life, whether it's like a voice assistant or a chatbot or something, when it keeps being wrong over and over again, you'd rather just not use it at all, even if sometimes it's going to be right. So I think even using something like GitHub Copilot, which is pretty helpful, but it is pretty much just autocomplete, like Steve said. And if it's wrong, it doesn't take a lot of time to reverse the changes. You can just delete the few lines of code that it gave you. So I think things like that are going to be super helpful. But if something is going to create a pull request and push the code without human review, that is probably not going to happen anytime soon, because if it goes wrong, that's going to be really bad, and it's going to take a lot of time to reverse. On the point of the demand for just software engineers in general, what I heard Mark Zuckerberg say recently, I don't know if you guys heard it as well, but he basically said that the reason that Meta has done the layoffs, and he said probably why other companies have done the same thing, is because it's not because of AI at all. It's just because they've realized that cutting a little bit of the bloat, like they had too many engineers than they needed. And it's not only that they're trying to save money, that's good for them, but he realized that by having less engineers, there is less overhead and they can actually move faster, which I think Steve kind of mentioned earlier. So that's one data point. You can't necessarily say Mark Zuckerberg knows everything, but I think he is in a position where he can say, he can kind of speak to the industry better than most people.
Yeah, I do think that the appetite for software is so enormous, and it will continue to be enormous, that I think a lot of the fears around, oh, our jobs are going to be taken away, I think that's misguided for two reasons. Number one is what has already been said, which is that at least my experience with these tools so far, and I think will continue to be true, is that they're much more focused on high precision in a very narrow area rather than high recall of doing everything a programmer does, right? And so I think that I'm pretty far from an AI junior programmer. Much more likely is, okay, this very specific code refactoring or this very specific kind of UI component, AI can augment you and make it way faster for you, right? So it's about more about augmentation rather than replacing. And the other part of it, I think, is that the appetite for building high quality software is, I don't think we really hit anywhere near that capacity in big tech or as an indie hacker, right? And so I think a lot of the fears around AI destroying software engineering are overblown.
It's 13:30.
One thing that I think about, this is like, a lot of you might have seen this very famous interview with Jeff Bezos. And I think he was at some sort of conference and someone asked him, like, what do you think will change in the next 5 or 10 years when it comes to Amazon? And he had this really insightful answer, which was around, a lot of things will change. The whole world might change. But what we think about at Amazon is what won't change in the world, right? In 5 years or 50 years from now, people will still care about really competitive prices, very fast delivery, high reliability. And that's, I think, a very interesting lens to look at a lot of things. So if you think about the next 5 or 10 years, yeah, I'm sure the editor we use, how advanced the AI is that we use, the code review tools that we use as engineers, a lot of that will change. It probably will change in a very dramatic way. But I think what won't change are when you're working on a team, which you will be working on a team in big tech, things like how do you communicate in real time? How do you present an idea, decompose a problem, have influence? How do you build relationships? Those things won't change. The importance of those, I don't think, will change, even with technology changing underneath. And so one piece of advice that I tell a lot of people is that think about that. Think about what do you think will be as important as it is now, or perhaps even more important, because the other parts of the job will be more and more, you'll have more AI augmented help in the future. So those things are actually going to become even more important. How can you build up those skills today so that you're equipped for that future in
And I think what you said about taking a long-term view, and maybe this is a good transition into the other point, is a really good one, especially for people thinking about getting into the industry. You know, right now it's very difficult, I think, for people, even with a ton of credentials, to get into the market. But if you take the lens of a 30 or 40-year career, right, I think that, you know, this sort of downturn, this reversion to the mean is a sort of like blip in cosmic timescales, right, or in the decades-long timescales. And so I do think that it's really difficult right now. But if you are thinking about getting into tech, if you are thinking about trying to get into big tech, I would totally recommend taking a longer term view and then sort of analyzing your skill set to see how you can become valuable to your potential future employers.
One specific question here, I want to jump to a comment that was on the post I made. Hamza's asking, when it comes to getting into the job market, what is your take on AI FOMO? Is it needed for me to learn the basics of artificial intelligence just because it's super hot right now? Or would you recommend focusing more on the things that we've been focusing on for the past 10 years, just, you know, leak code preparation, or code preparation maybe is better, or things like data structures and system design and things like that? What would you recommend, Stephen, Navi, for how much to really learn these different AI technologies right now?
I have a response to that, which is basically, I think that you should go really deep into AI if that's what you want to do, that's where your interest is. What you can take a look at within big tech right now is the innovations that are going on within AI at the product or feature level are happening at the very small teams, right? And what they're essentially doing is they're taking an existing problem that they have day to day, and they're leveraging AI not from these like big centralized novel models, but through APIs that have been exposed to them to help them solve a problem that may be endemic to their team. The people that are solving it on that micro level, on the two pizza team level, I don't think that you have to go deep into AI. I don't think you have to go deep into LLMs. I think you have to understand like the higher order concepts, and you should understand how to leverage them, and you should understand the strengths and weaknesses of using LLMs. But I don't think that you necessarily need to go deep. The places where big tech has a really big advantage right now are the billions of dollars that it takes to train these gigantic models. And what's going to happen within big tech and what we've seen is that there's going to be a gigantic investment into those shared resources, both for internal company use, but also exposed externally through APIs. And so if you want to work on that centralized piece that's cutting edge, where you're not just gluing together some API inputs and outputs, then I think that you should go deep. But in the absence of that, I think that, you know, focusing on software development while sort of keeping an eye on AI developments would be the thing that I would do.
Yeah, I think I have the exact same opinion as Steve, but I'll just give it, I guess, in different words. So the way I see it, I mean, there's a lot of cloud companies nowadays, and that's a relatively recent thing. But as many cloud companies that there are, cloud providers, there's even more companies that are actually using the cloud. So even with AI, there's going to be a lot of LLMs. Some of them might not last very long, some of them might, but there's going to be a lot more applications that use the LLMs than there are LLMs. And so I think, yeah, just figuring out how to actually just maybe use like the API if you're relatively new, just figuring out how to use like the GPT API, that might be a good start. But I think the next step might be learn how to use custom training data with some of these LLMs, because that is probably going to be something that it's hard to predict the future, but that might be something that every company is doing 10 years from now, using their own custom training data on an LLM that they did not create. And another point in terms of designs and infrastructure, those skills probably will translate to machine learning infrastructure. I mean, the LLMs have to be trained with servers and databases. I mean, some of the paradigms might change, like vector database, but the general concepts are probably not going to change. That's probably my take on it.
Can I get back to, I think, Steve, the question that you were answering, which is probably the most common question that the three of us get for people who are not yet in big tech. How do I get a big tech job, right? So first of all, maybe we can, the context here is, first of all, is it advisable if someone is a college kid or, someone who's relatively a couple years of experience, would you advise them, hey, you really should go work in big tech, Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, etc.? And then if the answer is yes, what would you recommend as the playbook on how to achieve that outcome?
I guess I'll go. Am I still here?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I guess in my opinion, so I'll just give my experience. So that's kind of the route I took. I worked at a big tech company, and I feel like you can 100% learn a lot from just being around other people and being a part of an organization where you are exposed to different types of people, different like processes and things, and you'll learn very, very quickly on things like code reviews, the basics like making design decisions, communicating with teammates, reviewing their work. So those types of basics you'll learn out of as well. But I think sometimes, like in life, you can also learn what not to do. And I think like sometimes in big tech, there's issues. I mean, you can say that about any company, but I think like working at Google, I also kind of learned a little bit of like things that definitely were not working out. I think from the outside, people look at a company like Google, which is a wonderful company, like technology-wise, it's as good as it can possibly be. But sometimes like business-wise, decisions can be made that just don't really make a lot of sense on the outside. You kind of wonder how was that decision made on the inside. And believe it or not, like there are just mistakes being made sometimes. People are prioritizing the wrong things and things like that. So I think any type of experience will teach you what to do, but you'll also learn what not to do. So I don't think it's a bad route to go into big tech, even if your ultimate goal is to start a startup or your own company. Now, how exactly to do that now? I mean, hiring is definitely lower than it was before, especially for juniors. I think some companies still are hiring. I think Meta might be one of the few that is doing it recently. So, of course, like that's out of your control. You can't control when a company is going to hire or how much they're going to hire. But it seems like just persevering, and if you can't get into a big tech company as your first company, it's really not the end of the world. That like you can always get there eventually. Like I would just take a long-term view on that. Try to get any type of experience that you can. Again, even a company that might not be your favorite, you might learn things like what not to do at that company, as well as things that you should do. There are smart people everywhere.
What a time to be alive right now. If you wanted to get into big tech or even software development from a non-tech place, that used to be completely locked up. There were no YouTube videos on how to prepare for the coding interview. You didn't even know that the coding interview existed, right? And with YouTube, with these different platforms that are out there, the barrier to entry into tech has never been lower. You could cobble together a curriculum for getting into big tech from LinkedIn lists and from YouTube that would be way more effective than the resources that I had when I was trying to get in. So it's an amazing time right now to get in. So the barrier to entry is really low. The question is, do you want to enter? And so if you are thinking about getting into tech or trying to get into big tech, that's a question I can't answer for people, because I think that's a very personal question. But it's so much easier to get into software than say to get into medicine or to get into law, right? And so if you like the concept of like problem solving, creating things, and then getting paid a ton, like it checks off quite a few boxes there. But if you don't like code, if you don't like computers, if you don't like any of that stuff, it's going to be very difficult to recommend this line of work, right? But the option is there compared to 20 years ago, compared to 40 years ago. Like you can literally self-study and get in. Once the economy sort of turns around, I think it'll be, hiring is going to come back. Who knows when that's going to happen? But man, like if you want it, it's there for the taking. I think if you're a bit patient.
And then, Steve, I will attempt to answer the question that you said was more of a personal choice about big tech or not. In my humble opinion, the answer is yes. You should try and get into big tech. I'll give you a couple of reasons why. I think no matter how much we want to think about tech as completely meritocratic, signaling and brand matters a ton. There's no denying that. And I think all three of us, like literally like in the title of the event and in all of our companies, I think we're all pretty prominently displaying, hey, we have this really big brand name, X Meta, X Google. Steve is soon to be X Amazon, right? That actually has a ton of mileage. We get a ton of mileage by saying that. And I think people assume, whether fairly or not, people assume that if you say I'm X Google, they think you're legit, right? So I think there's a lot of value there. I do think undeniably you get paid very well if you're in technical leaders and in big tech. And money gives you optionality. So getting money and earning for a few years before you go off and do your own thing, or before you go off and do some academic thing that you care about. Having money will help with that, I promise. So I think if you are like waffling between, should I do a startup or should I go in big tech, and you don't have a big brand name on your resume yet, my strong recommendation to everyone is at least consider it. You should really, really, by default, that should be something that you should try and do. I think at least once in your career. I mean, I think that the days of going into a company for 30 or 40 years, like my dad, for example, he was at General Motors for about 30 years. I think those days, at least in tech, are long gone. And with that in mind, most of these jobs are kind of two-way doors. Like you go in and you always have the option. And in fact, sometimes you don't even have the option, you'll get kicked out, which is totally fine. Like you should go in with the idea of, I'll be here for 2 or 3 or 5 years, I'll learn a ton. The Steves of the world, the people who've been at Amazon for 18 years, those people are very, very rare. And I think they will become increasingly rare, honestly. So I do think that when you think about a 40-year career, it is 100% worthwhile to at least do one tour of duty in some big tech company. In terms of how to get into it, I have one thing that I tell people all the time, which is that it is easier than ever, but I still think it's competitive because of how well known these companies are. There's obviously going to be a lot of people who apply. There's going to be 100 applications or hundreds of applications for every open position at Google if it's like a well-known job opening. And so my advice to people there is you have to figure out what is your unfair advantage and exploit that. Exploit that unfair advantage aggressively. So I'll tell you what people do, which is a totally backwards way of attacking the problem. Is, I want to go work at Google. And Google just put out a job listing on LinkedIn. I'm going to go apply. Every day I want to check LinkedIn, the Google page for LinkedIn, and apply for the entry level or senior level role at Google. It's a horrible way of going about it because on LinkedIn, you are competing with 900 million other people who could just as easily as you go into the Google LinkedIn page and click apply, easy apply. And the barrier to entry to applying for a job on big tech through LinkedIn is so low. So I have very little confidence that you'll actually get any meaningful data or result from that. I would much rather you figure out where do you have a network or a connection that other people don't have and use that to get a referral. Or maybe you have a college alumni database that you have access to that other people don't have access to, right? Or maybe you have a deep, deep expertise in a technology that other people don't. But these are all huge unfair advantages that you should be taking advantage of. And I think that is, in 2024, the way you get into a big tech company. And also, obviously the preparation, like using Decode, using doing all the DSA prep, that is like a prerequisite, of course, to pass the interview. But like getting the interview is often the hardest part.
Yeah, I echo that. There's two phases, right? You have to get the interview, and then you have to do well in the interview. And so you should definitely be leveraging your network to get the interview. Do you have friends that already work there, right? Like you can essentially get an interview if there is an opening within a company if you know somebody that works within that company, right? I think that my perspective on doing well on the interview is that there is a supply and a demand problem, right? The bar for interviews is sort of increased and artificial, but it is sort of it sort of exists. And I've done so many interviews in my career, very close to 1,000. I would say something on the order of, I don't know, a sixth of them are the ones that we extended an offer to. So that means that 5/6 of the people that are able to land an interview don't have the, they don't meet the bar. People on the interview aren't inclined. And what I was talking about earlier about the democratization of like interview prep, there are so many resources out there to sort of like reverse engineer the interview. And so I think that if you're able to land an interview in today's day and age, like what is going to be on the interview is essentially a bounded problem. I think in 20 years ago, that was an unbounded problem because you literally couldn't type into Google, interview, the coding interview. You couldn't type into Google the system design interview. You had no idea what they were going to ask you. You had to sort of go in code cold. Nowadays, it has been democratized and you know what's going to be on that interview and you can actually go in and prep. And so if you want to get into big tech, you have to think about it in terms of it being a closed and bounded problem and not an unbounded problem where you're trying to make a random walk to prepare for an interview.
Yeah, I think in my experience, 100% getting the interview was definitely the most difficult part. I think the market is a big factor in that. I would mostly just echo the advice that's kind of already been given in that cold applying, like you have to, the same way, like when you, at least like this is how I approach it because I'm kind of a one-dimensional person, but the same way when you're coding, you're trying to like optimize your code, you kind of have to think of the interview process the same way. If that's something, or the application process, if that's something you struggle with, you have to think about what is going to increase your chances. You'll never get to a point unless like you have a really strong referral or you have like a ton of experience. You're never going to get to a point where you can apply to a company and be 100% sure that they're going to give you an interview. But you can do things for sure that will increase your chances. And I think that's what it's about. Just kind of, especially now, it's pretty easy to revise a resume with AI tools. So like if you apply to 5 different companies and they all want a slightly different, they all require a slightly different tech stack, you can kind of tailor your resume for each of those companies a little bit differently. Like you can list the most relevant experience for that individual company, like first on your resume. That's like one small example. I don't know how like effective that might be, but little things like that you can optimize for. You can make sure that you're not just one application of a million, and network, of course, and just general advice like that. And it's not easy, but you're gonna have to put in the work. It's not gonna be free. It's gonna be harder than just clicking a button on a screen, but that's the way to do it.
I have one more question, and then to maybe figure out what the audience has in mind. So for those of you who want to get answered, there's a post on my profile. Please leave your comment there, and then the 3 of us will look at what's interesting in that question list, and we'll answer those. But the last question I have, Navi, maybe we'll start with you. You had this like brief stint at Amazon that you talked about publicly in a YouTube video, and then you went to Google, right? So we talked about the interview, passing the interview, etc. Last question here about the offer evaluation, or how to think about the company. So at least for me, when I think about long-term career success and evaluating a particular job, which will lead to long-term career success. I think about it in terms of compensation, in terms of stability, like how likely is it that I'll get laid off or fired? How much will I learn? And maybe how much brand there is, right? Those are at least 4 dimensions that I think about. Yes, Navi, if you have any kind of framework to evaluate job offer A versus job offer B, how do you make that decision?
So I'll definitely give the best answer I can, but I will say technically when I chose that Amazon offer, it was the only offer I had, and when I chose the Google offer, it was also the only offer I had. So I've never had to make a tough decision like that. But it's definitely true that like compensation is big, but I think optimizing for compensation in like the first 1 or 2 years actually might not be the best strategy because stability and like learning, those are important. I think it does depend like what you're trying to go for. Even if your goal is to make the most amount of money possible in your career over the, let's say the next 10 to 20 years, probably going in a company where you can learn more and possibly get promoted more quickly actually might be more important than like what first offer you're actually given. So like let's say when you're a junior you make X amount of money. When you're a senior you can probably make twice as much. So even if you get the goal should be to get promoted. To be honest, if you're trying to make as much money as possible, it should be to get promoted or to learn a lot of stuff and maybe get some system design skills so that you can interview at other companies and then get a higher level via just switching companies without getting promoted. So I think, yeah, that's how I would see it. And even if you don't get a super high paying job as your first job, you can learn on the side still and then optimize that way so that you can, get another offer in the future. So that's how I would think about it, at least in terms of compensation. In terms of like what exactly the individual person wants, I think that's up to you. But there are definitely resources out there that can tell you how stable is a company, how much are you going to learn, how quickly are you going to get promoted, and just doing research like that.
I like it. Steve, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I've only had one job. I will say that I have evaluated a bunch of internal team offers, and so my advice here is I think it sort of echoes not. You need to think about the global maximum instead of the local maximum when you're doing optimization. And so what I've always found to be accelerators that really move the needle, especially early career, is making sure that you have a manager that is awesome, right? I think there's this misunderstanding that people think that all managers are the same. Managers can also get tips, right? There are high-performing managers and not so high-performing managers. And so, like, whatever you can do to understand, like the most critical relationship within your job is going to be with your manager, and making sure that relationship, right, that you're prioritizing if you are in a situation with multiple offers. And then the second one is, I think a really high leverage early accelerator is working around people that are really good, right? So I would de-emphasize things like a specific tech stack or like a sexy product, and I would emphasize things like working around people that are higher level than you that you can learn from, right? I think osmosis and being around people that are really good is the fastest way to up-level yourself, because you essentially can just mimic them and ape what they're doing and then sort of like gain their skills just by being around them. And so if you're in a situation where you can evaluate, your team and your manager from the outside, it might be kind of difficult, but those are the dimensions I would double click on. Obviously compensation, obviously like location, those things are also considerations, but I would highly optimize for the first two.
I agree. As someone who got 5 offers when I initially graduated from university, and then I got 6 during my next major job search hunt, and then that's how I joined Meta. I've definitely been in this situation a lot. So I think that I basically agree with everything that's been said. One interesting insight is that sometimes, or not even sometimes, I would say oftentimes, there's not a trade-off that you need to necessarily make between where will you get the maximum learning and the maximum compensation. I mean, of course, there probably are cases where that's not true, but like, I'll tell you, if you are on a good team at Meta or Google or Amazon, there's also a really good chance that'll be one of your highest offers because they are big tech, right? And so that's been my experience at least. Whereas if you go to some startup which doesn't really have proven leadership, doesn't really have a proven product, you might go and you think you're going to learn a lot. But at least I'll tell you my experience joining as a founding engineer in 2014, a startup. I don't think I learned that much because I honestly didn't have the requisite skill set to be independent. And that was really, I think, what was required or what they were looking for in a founding engineer, someone who could really take the initiative, be completely independent, and figure things out. And I frankly did not have that toolkit. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I do think here's another take on it, which is I'm not sure about Amazon or Apple as much, but I'll tell you at Google and Meta, the two companies I'm most familiar with, they have fairly large teams of contractors. And just being really blunt about it, being a contractor at one of these companies is not a good place to be. You're not given autonomy. You're not able to build relationships with the full-time employees. No one really cares. You can't write performance review feedback for folks. So you kind of become devalued by default. And so if you think about your job that you're going to be taking on one end of the spectrum, you'll be a contractor. You're basically a code monkey. You're given tasks and you have to on them. And on the other end of the spectrum, you are the tech lead for the most important initiative of the company. Figure out where are you on that spectrum. Just be really clear about where, like in a startup, they might actually want you to be more toward the code monkey contractor end of the spectrum because they just want to get things done. Whereas ideally, you want to go work for a company where you're really given a lot of time and ability to build relationships and understand the business and be a true tech lead or grow into a true tech lead. So what Steve said about evaluating your manager, I think that's a big part of it. Like, do they actually care, or do they just can you get the perception that they're going to just assign you work, which is a bad place to be. Usually, talking to individual contributors will give you a more honest answer compared to talking to the manager. That's another recommendation if you have a couple offers. Like, make sure you talk to senior ICs of the company rather than just the management chain. And then, yeah, brand I think is also important, as I mentioned before. Okay, we're almost at time here. I don't know, Navi and Steve, if you have time for like one or two more that we can take from the questions that were showing up in that post I made. Is that cool with you guys?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So one that I like, I'll take one that I like, and maybe if you guys have any that have been asked that you like, then I'll take that one. But the one that I like from Ash Chloe is about once you get into big tech, or maybe we could make it broadly any company, how do you personally track if you are thriving? And this is actually really relevant. Navi, you made a really good video about how you got promoted at Google. You were doing probably very well. Steve, obviously you did well. 18 years becoming a principal engineer at Amazon.
It's 14 hours.
What systems did you use to understand how you were doing with the company?
I think for me, so I was pretty like new into my career, so I didn't really know what good and bad even was, to be honest. I think part of what Steve said, just like learning through osmosis, like seeing what other people are doing and kind of learning from them, because people are really good at learning, like with context. Like if you're learning a new like human language, being in a country where people are speaking that language is going to help you learn very quickly. So you can pick up patterns. You can figure out what is this engineer doing on my team that's working really well, and what is this other person not doing? Why is this person a tech lead where this other person isn't? Like, what's the difference? What is the tech lead doing better than the other person? So via that, you can kind of figure out what are the good habits that you should be building. And so in terms of just learning what to do, that's how I kind of approached it. But to track how well you're doing, I just appreciated like feedback from my team. Sometimes it's hard to actually get that in big tech, at least in my case, because people don't want to be mean. Like they don't want to give you something that can be interpreted as criticism. So I would always check in like with my manager when you have like a one-on-one with your manager. Like I would ask in any way that I could for feedback, and I would ask like, how am I doing? What could I be improving on? What's going well? And that's how I track it, because ultimately like what your manager thinks is going to be the most important in terms of promotion and like the performance reviews. Also like what your tech lead and your teammates in general think as well. Like the people that you're working most closely with, you want them to like you and them to have a good opinion of you. So that's how I kind of prioritized it.
For me, I knew that I was thriving if I was growing, right? And I think just echo what Noah said, when you first start at a company or when you first start working in general, you don't even know what is what. It is an unknown sort of situation. You don't know what's on the menu. You don't know how you're going to be evaluated. You don't understand the tech stack, right? And I think you know that you're growing because new dimensions open up, right? And you're sort of, you understand the difference between a good performance and a good piece of code and a good project delivery and a bad one. And you start to develop some amount of taste, and you can start to observe and understand, what the company does and the why. And so, at least personally for me, like I know that I'm thriving when I'm just when I'm learning like a ton, right? In terms of knowing that you're thriving in terms of like a performance management framework, all of these big companies do, yearly performance reviews, and that will give you a much more objective measurement about how you're doing. And that's about, what the company that you work for sort of values. I think that, there's this Goldilocks zone where the things that you want to do, like grow and to learn more and to up-level yourself, and the business objectives and what the company thinks is really important, where that Venn diagram, that intersection is really large. And so I've been lucky with my career that's always been the case. So I've been able to use the performance review process within the company as a proxy for my own growth and to know whether I'm thriving or not.
And the way I think about it is that, the most obvious way to tell if you're thriving is going to be your actual evaluation. Most of these big tech companies are pretty good about every 6 months or every year. They'll tell you, it'll be pretty explicit. Like, are you meeting expectation, below expectation, above expectation, right? So that's kind of an obvious indicator. If you're getting promoted, clearly you're doing well. I think the more helpful thing, though, in my opinion, is the performance evaluation you get is a trailing indicator. So in the past 6 months or past year or whatever it was, how are you doing relative to your expectation? And at that point, it's kind of too late. Like, if you really sucked and you're going to get on a pit, then you kind of you want to know that ahead of time, right? And so a leading indicator, I think, is the more actionable thing that all of you should really be thinking about. Like, how can you proactively figure out how are you trending, so you're not surprised by the rating that you end up getting. And so for that, I have two thoughts. One is kind of, Navi, what you were saying about learning from other people, right? Just like talk to them and say, hey, what are you working on? And how can I help? And like get their feedback as well on how you're doing. I think the way you ask for feedback matters a lot. Usually, if you say like, hey, am I doing okay? 95% of people in the world are like, oh yeah, you're doing okay. Even if you're not doing okay, they don't want to have that hard conversation with you. And so it's your job to figure out how do you phrase the question in a way such that you actually get something concrete to improve on. The other element of getting better or like proactively figuring out how to improve is observing people, right? So not just talk to the tech lead or talk to the manager, but look at their output. Look at how much code are they writing or reviewing. Look at how many design documents they're authoring. And figure out, is there a big delta between you and them? So if you write like 100 lines of code per month, other people on the team are writing 1,000 lines of code, that's probably a bad sign. We shouldn't measure software engineers purely based off of code output. We all know that. But at least you should be in the ballpark. Otherwise, there's probably something that has gone wrong, right? So talking to people and then observing their behavior, I think, are the two ways to understand how are you trending. Okay, so with that, I would love, Steve and Navi, if you have any question that you saw either message to you directly or on that thread that I posted, if there's anything interesting that you want to answer, let's do that. Otherwise, we can start your phone.
Navi, I'm taking a look at the questions now.
Yeah. Yes. One slightly controversial one. Is big tech still the beacon of career stability that it was prior to layoffs? I think that's interesting. I guess like the perception is definitely that it's not as stable as it was before. I think it was mentioned earlier that like Google is known as a really stable company. You don't expect that you're ever going to get like laid off when you go into Google, but they did do layoffs. But I think that history is long. I mean, what made people think that Google was never going to do layoffs in the first place? It's been around for I think 20 years ish, and they didn't do layoffs in that time period because they were growing very very quickly. And of course, growth isn't going to last forever. So I think just zooming out in history, there's going to be other companies probably that emerge that are going to be really stable for 20 years and they'll never have layoffs. And they might create a perception that they're never going to do layoffs, but I think business is business, and that's why I kind of just like look at history, like what happened over a long period of time, because that'll teach you more than the last 10 or 20 years, which humans are going to be biased towards like recency. So yeah, I guess that might not be like a concrete answer, but that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add on one thing there, which is I mean, it's maybe an interesting question to ask whether big tech is still a beacon of stability, but I actually am not sure if that's the right. I don't know if it's worth spending that much time as engineers to really think about that. I think the assumption we all should have is I'm doing a job, and when the value of that job to me is no longer there, I will move on. In the same way that when the company makes a decision that their value that they get from me as an employee is no longer there, they'll let me go. They have no issue firing, and that's made abundantly clear in the past year and a half or 2 years when people started to get laid off in the hundreds of thousands. And so rather than thinking about where can I go and park myself for 10 years or 15 years, I think that is a recipe, in my opinion, of your career will stagnate. And instead, the attitude should be for the next 2 or 3 years. But in my opinion, that's like the correct time horizon if you're starting out. In the next 2 or 3 years, where do I think I'll get a really good network and gain really marketable skills that I can then transfer over into the next job? Because I'm not married to this job, I will move on. That would be my my take on that question.
There's a question from Stephen in the thread. What should experienced engineers be doing to future-proof their careers and stay competitive and marketable? My take is that, well, just to back up a little bit, I think the difference between a software engineer and maybe a software developer is the software engineer is solving problems, and they're solving problems with a ton of constraints. They might be trying to optimize, as opposed to a software developer or programmer. It's just like coding, right? I think the way to future-proof yourself is to make sure that you have a track record of solving bigger and bigger problems. At the end of the day, if you have a track record, if you have a history of being able to solve problems that are even larger and larger, there will always be a market for you, because there are so many problems in the world. There's so many problems in the world that can be solved by software. There's so many problems within software itself. And I don't think that that's going away if we want to circle back to durability. And so I would focus maybe a little less on the emerging technologies that are there and just sort of trust that you'll be able to pick up the newest framework or the newest language or the newest paradigm. All of those things are tractable and understandable. The thing that is rare and valuable in the marketplace are people that have a track record of solving bigger and bigger problems with software. If I was a business owner, if I was a corporation, I'm trying to find people that can sort of fill a really large hole that I have within the organization, or to solve a problem that I don't know how to get out of. And I think that is always a marketable and durable skill.
I love it. anything to add to that? Navi, do you have anything on that topic? How to stay marketable?
I think probably nothing great. So yeah, I'll leave it there as well.
Okay, amazing. Is there anything else before we do our concluding remarks that any other questions that are interesting?
I think we got through most of the ones. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Well, Navi, Steve, I really appreciate you doing this. I'm going to ask you each just to say some final words, but this is super fun. I hope if you all got any value out of this, can we get some sort of reaction, like a thumbs up or heart or laugh emojis, something within the LinkedIn thing? That would be super helpful. Okay, I see some coming in. Yeah, I had a ton of fun. So, Navi, Steve, thanks for doing this. Steve, do you want to go first and just say where we can find you or connect with you further?
Yeah, there's my YouTube channel. It's youtube.com @ A Life Engineer. If you go to my profile, you can get subscribe to my newsletter. I send out content every Wednesday. And then, yeah, other than that, if you want to chat with me, there's also my Discord. You can find links to that in my LinkedIn profile.
Yeah, Navi, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, you can probably just search for NeetCode. I think that's what all my socials and accounts are, other than on LinkedIn. Yeah, so my YouTube is NeetCode. I have two YouTubes actually. One is NeetCode, one is NeetCode.io. People get confused about that. I also have a website called NeetCode.io, NeetCode.io. If you're preparing for coding interviews, you can check that out. But yeah.
Okay, amazing. And then for me, yeah, YouTube and LinkedIn are the biggest places I post a lot. So unfortunately, Rahul Pandey is a super, super common Indian name. There's like 15 Rahul Pandays on YouTube. So I think I'm the top result. If not, please tell me. I'm like competing with a Bollywood singer named Rahul Pandey. So just look up Rahul Pandey on YouTube. I think I should be there, up there, at least number 1 or 2. And then, yeah, you're obviously already know that I'm on LinkedIn. And then the company I have is called Taro, jointaro.com. Again, hard to get Taro.com. It's a Japanese pharmaceutical company. Jointaro.com. So would love me to check that out. If you have any feedback or questions, I'm always open to learning and hearing from all of you. Okay. Well, Navi, Steve, I think we should try and do this again at some point. This is super fun. Good to catch up with both of you as well.
Absolutely, anytime. And I think if you do like a song and dance routine to compete with the other Rahul, I'm definitely.
Well, you probably don't want to see me. Oh, neither will help my case to compete. But if it gets the views. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll hope to do this again in a few months.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. See you.
So I want to make I want to speak what I want to say in this meeting. So according to the big tech evolution, I want to propose that corporate entrepreneurship model, we need to promote crowdsourcing in the big tech. I have several ideas. I have this problem, and I would like to propose a model in order to establish the organization could allow to any human in the world who have an idea to test it, to evaluate it. So we want to make this system, and coming soon, I hope to make it with Meta, with Google, and Amazon. The big tech evolution and what it means for what it means for humanity. I would like to propose it. Then when I have time, I will make another video, or I will improve the idea with the conversation of Mindset team. Mindset will be another big tech evolution. Let's do it. And the rest of organization. Happy New Year, Happy New Century, and Happy New Millennia. Hope we can live for millennia. In this case, Google with Calico Labs, Amazon with Alto Labs. The founders, they invested in both company of biotechnology. I think that it will be our most complex challenge. And I want to invite to Meta to invest in biotechnology. I am not sure if they have investment, but that's the next step. So Let's move to Web 3, Web Semantic Web, or Web 4. Let's move to Eternal Life for Humanity. Let's make it together. It is the best time of humanity, of the history of our civilization. Let's go to at least a level 1 type civilization according to Kardashev scale. And we must improve this scale, and we need to study the Drake equation, and we need to connect with extraterrestrials such as me. There are a lot of extraterrestrials in this planet, so let's evolve this civilization because we have more work in another civilization. I am very happy to be in this planet. It is very beautiful, and I want to leave soon because I have a lot of work in the universe. Bye-bye.